Hi, welcome to our first office hours. I'm Carl Bruch. I'm one of the core faculty on the MOOC for Environmental Security and Sustaining Peace. And this is David Jensen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
And the idea behind the office hours is to allow people an opportunity to ask questions, to comment on what they're seeing. We will try to hold these once a week, and there will be different faculty who are joining as office hours, so you'll get a chance to interact with us. People can submit comments in advance, and a number of students already have. You can also submit comments or questions as we're going along live, and we will try to answer them. I should be clear, this could be comments or it could be questions. It could be on things that are in the MOOC. It could be things that may be coming, or it could be on related topics. David and I are happy to engage on these. David, is there anything else that you'd like to add here?
No, just to say, let's keep this to some extent informal. Let's have a good discussion, and let's just keep in mind that is as much as we have provided a structure and content for the course, a huge amount of the content is coming from the actual participants. And so we really encourage that kind of cross-peer exchange and knowledge sharing between everyone. So welcome, and we're really excited to take this and get going.
Excellent. And so I think I'd like to start with a question that was posed in advance. And the student was asking about, in chapter 1.3, we made reference to 3 risks in natural resources and environment during armed conflict. And the student was wondering, could you explain the difference between financing conflict and natural resources as a revenue stream? Would have thought that risk 3, the natural resources as a revenue stream, continues to finance conflict. And strictly speaking, that is absolutely correct. We were trying to highlight three risks. They are financing conflict, which the student identified, environment as a weapon of war, and the damage to the environment during armed conflict, by armed conflict and by people who are coping with the conflict scenario. And the distinction to be made between natural resources as a revenue stream and financing conflict is to say that natural resources can provide a revenue stream that may be used for financing conflict, but it can also just be used for livelihoods, for trade, for economic development. And so the point of natural resources as a revenue stream was not meant to be one of the risks. It was really talking about the broader context in which conflict financing occurred. David, there was a similar question from chapter 1.4 where you were referring to territorial planning, wondering if you could expand on that.
Yes, absolutely, Carl. Thanks for the question. So the question was really if I could clarify what is meant by the territorial planning process in the context of peace building in Colombia. And it's a very specific process whereby each municipality has to undertake what they're calling a territorial plan. That's a local land use plan, which has to be developed by the municipality, by the stakeholders in the municipality, where they will look at a whole series of questions with respect to natural resource use and come up with a plan and a way to zone different kinds of uses. And every municipality is doing these plans, and then that will form, in a sense, a bottom-up input into an overall national peace-building strategy. So the territorial planning process is not land reform. It's not formalization. Those might come out of it, but the immediate territorial planning is really it's really a land use planning process and an input, a local level input into the national peace building process.
I realized there's one more thing that we should note as an introduction, that this office hours are being recorded so that people who are not able to join us at this time can watch it. It will be available on the platform, and this applies to the other office hours that we'll have through the course. There's a question that might be interesting for both David and me to address. This is asking, what are the strategies to make decision makers adequately aware of their decision consequences and to make better decisions to prevent conflicts? The person goes on to say, I guess many know that certain decisions are risky to cause conflicts, but still take the chance. And David, I don't know if you want to start with that one or if you'd like me to start.
You go ahead, Carl, and I'll chip in.
Okay, so when you're working in a conflict-affected setting, you're absolutely right that decision makers generally know that their decisions can cause conflicts. They also know that the decision to act or to not act is the decision, and so they often still take the chance. The question, though, I think this really raises is, how do decision makers, how do people who are designing programs and projects, people who are implementing them, how do they reduce the potential impacts of their actions and their decisions, particularly the likelihood that it might aggravate or generate new conflicts? And this is the realm of conflict-sensitive programming. And there are a number of tools that we will discuss in Module 4 on how to conduct conflict-sensitive programming. Some of these are specific in the context of natural resources and environmental considerations, but others are much broader and deal with questions of inequality or how to deal with how to understand the context that you're working in and to design and operationalize those projects. I think one of the big things is something that's variously called a conflict assessment or conflict impact analysis that can be done quickly. It can be done on an ongoing basis, but it's a way to understand what the different key actors are, what their interests are, and where the fault lines are. So some of these things might be understanding whether natural resources were a cause of conflict, whether they were used to finance conflict. But there are also other very things that have nothing to do with the resource itself, such as where are the different ethnic groups? And if you're working with the government, and generally the government has ownership, they might be directing projects to areas that support them and directing projects away from areas that don't support them. So if you're drilling wells or training farmers, it could all be going to certain ethnic groups. And so there's a need to be aware of these risks and to be able to have a dialogue with the government. I think the third thing that I would say here is that it's really good to have examples of both how natural resource related decisions can spark conflict or can aggravate conflict, and how understanding these risks can then allow the project to move forward with a less likely impact on the conflict dynamics. David?
Yeah, let me just add a couple of points to that, Carl. That was great. I think there's 2 points I'd like to add. First and foremost, I think you need to understand where you sit or where a certain situation sits vis-a-vis the election cycle, and how far are way or close are we to an election, and how could that decision potentially affect their political constituency for that election. This sounds very pragmatic, but senior decision makers very much think about that all the time. And so mitigating potential risks that could cost them an election or cost them political support is something that they listen to. The other thing they listen to, of course, is funding, and what are the implications of a decision in terms of disrupting their donor support or disrupting their project support. And so I think you can frame it often in terms of political risk, financial risk, and really try to bring it back to the individual and see if that helps raise awareness, or at least help provide different options going forward. But I think the just to build on what you said, Carl, I think the conflict sensitivity chapter is in the next module, in module 2, and it's delivered by Mark Levy. So I think that's a really good module to watch to answer this question.
Excellent. There's also a comment that significant portion of the course participants, we have a very interesting group of participants, and we've been really enjoying getting to know them. We have professionals, we have students. The question is relating more to the students, and wondering if we could speak a bit about the professional skills that are in demand for those working in environmental security and peace building. And related to that is what sorts of skills or knowledge students should be seeking out if they want to work in this field. David, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I can certainly say that when we're looking to recruit people into this particular branch to work on this topic, the first thing isn't actually a skill. It's attitude, attitude, attitude. It's the ability to learn on your feet. It's the ability to be positive, to find solutions, and to really be willing to do whatever it takes to get the job done. And so number one is attitude. And those that have a great attitude usually stay a very long time and are very successful. And those that have a difficult attitude, or think they're above certain work, or don't know how to engage with people on the ground, typically don't have long careers here. So first and foremost, attitude. I think the second, for me, the second core skill is being able to analyze the problem through multiple lenses. You've got your environmental lens, your conflict lens, your livelihood lens. Looking at a problem through multiple lenses and understanding what that problem means to those different constituencies or those different experts, and how they might go about solving it, and then trying to find a solution that is based on those different perspectives. I think that's so fundamental in this particular landscape. And then the third skill, I would say, is the ability to adjust your language and your approach based on who you're interacting with, and really understanding your audience when you're in the field, who you're talking to, what's the kind of language you need to adopt, how can you be really clear in your language, how can you respect the culture, how can you really understand how to collect information in a sensitive way, and then how do you communicate that? How can you communicate that to decision makers, to stakeholders, to companies, to governments, to other agencies? So people who are good at understanding language and understanding communication, I find those are really essential skills to be successful in this particular field. And that's in addition to some of the technical side that we're working on in the course. Carl?
I completely agree. And it was an interesting question because I was thinking about it. To me, the skills are more important than the knowledge. Understanding the resource curse, yes, that's important, but there are so many nuances. It's good to know the basic mechanics and modalities, but it's really important to be able to adapt to your new situation, to dive into it, to understand, or to try to understand the situation and not necessarily prejudge it. But I think the skills and the practical side is really important, because yes, there are a lot of themes that we see time and time again in different places, but you have to be really careful about just taking the approach that you used in your previous place and applying it here. And then I really like the attitude comment. To me, there are things that it's not innate. These are things that you can learn, things that you can cultivate, but the ability to understand a a situation from different perspectives, I think, is absolutely key. It's kind of like a Robert Altman film or one of these films where you have 20 different people and they're all engaged in the same process, but they have different backgrounds, different histories. They see things and interpret things differently. And so I think that it's the ability both to engage with those different people, to listen and to try to understand where they're coming from. I think that then helps you to communicate with them. It's not necessarily that you're changing the underlying message of what you're saying necessarily. I like to think of it as a crystal with many facets, and somebody's going to be interested in the livelihoods aspect. Somebody else is interested in the revenues aspect, or somebody else is interested in the equity aspect. These are all parts of the same dynamic, but people might be looking at the dynamic through a different facet. And so related to that is the ability to work in a team and to communicate. And, it's not always fun working in a team. Sometimes people don't carry their own weight. They may have different standards. They may be too exacting or not exacting enough. But you really have to learn how to work in a team and how to enjoy it and how to be effective in that. On the technical side, I would say that a few things that are really worth focusing on. One is conflict sensitivity and how does that work, the different tools. Another are languages. The more languages you have, at least some basic command of, it shows respect and the ability to understand how people are framing things, not just the words, but the concepts that are often implicit in the wording. And then I think there's also, I don't know if this is a technical skill or if it's an attitude, but the ability to work with incomplete information. These situations are very messy. The data isn't always available. It may be contested. So how do you work with incomplete information? And I think that part of that is what's called adaptive management. And I believe that that's addressed in one of the later chapters. But basically, the approach is to determine your policy, what your objective, I should say, analyze how the policy options might work in this situation, make a policy choice, implement it, monitor and evaluate, and then adjust your decision. So your policy choice or your action is never truly final. You're taking your best guess on available information, even as you continue to collect information. And then you ask, is this the right course? And then there are whole sorts of other technical aspects, including monitoring and evaluation, environmental and social impact assessment, development of project proposals, and so forth. And these will come up throughout the course. But I think the skill side of things is critically important. David, is there anything that you'd add?
Yeah, I just want to say that the more individual disciplines you have, I'm getting some bad feedback all of a sudden. Are you hearing that, Carl?
Just a little, not too much.
The more individual disciplines you know about, the more tools you have for solving problems. So Carl talked about adaptive management, and actually that's the same thing in the software development world called agile programming, where you just you assume you don't know what the end user needs until you get out there and actually put a piece of software in front of them and get feedback. And it's exactly the same thing in this context. So it really helps to have analogies, or it helps to have tools from other disciplines to apply in this one. And I think the other thing I wanted to pick up on, Carl, was the ability to listen. I think above all, if I had to say anything, it would be that listening to people and letting them tell you what the needs are and what the solutions are. And really, from my side in the UN, helping convene them together, help facilitate those discussions. But actually, the solutions are all coming from the ground up. And I keep saying this in all of my course notes and anytime I get in the platform. Internationals don't build peace in other countries. It's nationals and locals that are building peace, and the solutions are coming from them. And our job is to listen and to really help them and to provide that context, to provide the convening structures that can help those solutions bubble up. And so, yeah, listening is absolutely essential, and being very humble. Being very humble in how you approach this. We don't know everything. We don't have all the answers. And really, we have to find those answers from the people who are involved in these conflicts.
And I think one of the things that's very interesting is that there are different ways that people talk. Sometimes it takes hours and hours before somebody gets to the point. And so the ability to listen is not just listening the way that your culture wants you to listen, but it's in that it's more in their culture. And so that I'm not certain, David, thoughts on how somebody would find out what are the cultural norms on listening there? How long is it? Hours? Is it days? How do you learn that on the ground?
You have to spend as much time as possible on the ground with the affected communities, and I think you have to get over this idea that you can projectize a peace building plan in a week, right? It's ridiculous to be able to stick a time frame on a process where you have no trust, where you don't know anything about the context, and you come in. You need to win people over, and that takes as much time as it takes. It's not something you can predetermine in advance. So I think you'll know it when you see it, and it's really hard to stick a time frame on these processes in advance of spending the time with people on the ground.
There was a student just asked a question in reference to South Sudan, and it was asking, in what ways can the environment contribute towards sustainable peace in the country?
Yeah, Carl, when I use the word environment, and this is part of this question of language, I use it in a larger sense to be environment and natural resources. And I think in South Sudan, of course, the question of oil and oil revenues, for me, it's a textbook case in terms of the potential opportunity, but also the massive risk, and why you need to ensure you have the governance mechanisms, the safeguards in place to transform those revenues into peace building and development gains. So I see the potential oil sector as a potential major contributor to peace building, if those revenues can be transformed into investments and jobs and livelihoods, etc. The problem is they're not being transformed, and I think there's been a major failure in terms of putting the governance mechanism in place to allow that wealth to be transformed and to be governed and managed appropriately. And this is where we have, I'd say, a major challenge in the UN system, because obviously this is a sovereign member state. It has complete sovereign control over its resource revenues, and they can do with them what they choose. The UN cannot go in and simply take over and restrict sovereignty or shared sovereignty over any country. And so it's this question of how can you help a conflict-affected country, a post-conflict country, make the right decisions about its revenues if it doesn't want help, if it's not asking for help. What are the tools and levers that we have to really encourage that help more systematically? And this is a big problem, and this is a big question that a lot of people have been asking throughout the course. And I'm hoping as people take the full suite of lectures, they'll come up with solutions to this, because this is a quintessential challenge. And I don't have the answer in how you go about doing this, precisely because of this limitation of sovereignty and this very tight control over this fundamental principle in the UN system.
I completely agree. I had the opportunity to work in South Sudan just before the conflict broke out, but after the extended conflict with Sudan. And I think that the dynamics that you described, David, are critically important. I've also seen that there are other levels, and so the oil oil and how the oil revenues are spent affect a lot of different aspects of life and politics and political economy in the country. I would also hazard that land and forestry and in different ways, wildlife and water are also really important, more often at the local level. After South Sudan gained independence, there was a new question about how centralized or decentralized should decisions over these resources be. And there was one of the pioneers in South Sudanese politics in the independence movement, John Garang, talked about how the people owned the land and the people owned the forests. But when the new government came in, suddenly they were wanting to control more of the resources, including the land and forests, which were important for the communities, for their livelihoods, for their welfare, and to their identities. So there are other dynamics that come into these resources that are they're different from the oil revenue questions. And then water that's also a different resource, different characteristics. And we saw USAID and other donor agencies and NGO partners really using water as an opportunity to show peace dividends, where people were wanting access to clean water and trying to provide pumping stations and trying to regularize and provide access to clean water. And so I think that it's important to think at multiple levels with different resources, and what's the nature of this resource? How can it help the peace process at this level or with this dynamic?
Can I just build on what you said, Carl? I absolutely agree. That whole concept of levels is like one of the fundamental learning objectives of the course, is to think about all the natural resources you have and at what level could they contribute to peace building. And one of the lectures we have coming up in Module 4 is about Wadi El Ku, which is in Darfur. And in that lecture, the important point here is using shared water between different users as a platform for rebuilding the relationships between those users. And that's another key learning objective of the course. Using environment to bring people together, but then to build relationships and build trust between them. So between users on the ground, and local authorities, and then between local authorities, users on the ground, and the national government, and using one natural resource to try to rebuild those connections and rebuild those relationships. And that's exactly what we're doing in Wadi El Ku, and that's a really important contribution to local level peace building, using natural resources as the arena for doing so.
And David, in that vein, a student just asked, do you believe a smaller sized country has a better opportunity to solve the conflict or not, in terms of governance, fewer stakeholders, resources availability, smaller areas?
You're asking me, personally, I do think that is the case. I think a lot of it is about state control and territorial control, and the smaller the country, the somewhat easier it is to maintain that kind of territorial control and presence and services and infrastructure and these kind of things. I think a lack of services, a lack of control, a lack of presence in very rural areas can often be an indicator or a risk in terms of conflict potential. So I think if I had to give you an immediate answer, I would say that it is easier to govern a smaller territory than a larger one. On the downside, there's probably less economic opportunity. There's less of a natural resource base. And so, there's less opportunity to develop different natural resources and actually have a more sustainable economy. So it'd be interesting to look at that relationship between territorial size and conflict risk. I don't think I've done that. I haven't seen a paper about that, but I'm sure there must be something in that vein. But it's a great question, Carl. How would you respond to that?
My visceral reaction, based on very little data, but is very similar to yours. That the bigger the countries, the more likely the local actors feel that they can do better on their own. The capital does not project its power as well across the whole country. It gets really difficult And where you have smaller units, you can often reach that decision. But I mean, that's just based on anecdotes, and I think that, as you say, I haven't seen any analysis on this. This would be a wonderful paper. If anybody's looking for a master's or PhD thesis, this is the sort of thing that there are so many interesting questions in this field that we have not yet answered. And I think that the question of does size matter would be a great question to look at in this context.
Just let me add on to that, Carl. When we were in DRC, we were looking at the peacekeeping mission, the size of the peacekeeping force. And I think it was something like 19,000 troops, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around that number, 17, 19,000. And it was the largest peacekeeping force at the time. And we were really impressed by that number. And we thought, fantastic, it's a big force. They can probably start looking at the illegal use of natural resources as part of their mandate. And we were taken aside by the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General, who basically said, it's a big force relative to a country like Sierra Leone, but in DRC, that is one peacekeeper for every 142 kilometers squared. So it's an absolutely massive territory. It's the size of Western Europe, with one country, in one country with very limited cross-territorial infrastructure. There is no territorial road network across the entire country. You've got to fly around to get to the major cities. And I remember him telling me that, Congo economically is not sort of one economic country. It's probably about 7 different countries where you have cross-border economies with their neighbors, but not a huge amount of internal economic coherence. And imagine how hard that is to govern. And that really put it into perspective how a large country can be very, very difficult to govern and to project state authority relative to a smaller place like Sierra Leone or Liberia.
I'm wondering if we might jump to Latin America. We have 2 different student questions. First one being, how can we as a citizen and decision makers prevent a crisis of the implementation of the peace? Nowadays in Colombia, we are in elections and some political campaigns are against the peace.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about how they're against the peace. I guess they're against the actual conditions of the peace agreement. I'm sure, I would imagine they're for peace, but they don't like some of the amnesty provisions and different provisions of the peace agreement, and therefore they're probably campaigning against that. But I'd love to hear more about what that actually means in practice. And I'd be very keen to hear more. So please tell us a little bit more in the chat window about what you mean by against the peace.
And then the other question from Latin America is asking if we could speak a little about the conflicts in Brazil, particularly related to the construction of hydroelectric plants and mining activities in sensitive environmental areas such as the Amazon.
You want to take that one first, Carl?
Sure. So one of the things that I think is this I think is a great entry point to the broader issue that while a lot of what we're talking about in this MOOC relates more to wars, civil wars, and armed conflicts, we are also, these dynamics and the solutions also apply to social and socioeconomic conflicts like the ones you describe here. And it applies at local levels where there often may be violence, often is violence. And so the questions of what are the environmental causes or environment-related causes of conflict, here you have what's often referred to, there are 2 types of conflicts of values and where that deals with people have different values for this certain resource. It may be their home, it might be related to identity, or it might be related to the environmental integrity. or it might be hydropower or revenues. So there are different things that you're trying to weigh as a decision maker, how to weigh one type of use versus another type of use. But those can be particularly difficult to negotiate and to navigate and to resolve. The other types of causes of conflict tend to be around where there's a single resource where people are in agreement what it should be used for. It may be minerals, and this is an opportunity for livelihoods and economic development. But the question is, who should benefit from it and in what percentage? And so there's more of a competition. People are in agreement on what the value is, but they're in disagreement as to who benefits from it. And so I think a lot of the conflicts in Brazil are those conflicts of values that can be very difficult to resolve. I think that it doesn't make them any less important. And in fact, I think that this is an area that warrants substantial work. But we see a number of tools, and these are addressed in terms of consultation, benefit sharing, planning, that can be used to reduce or prevent or resolve conflicts. And so as you go through the course, look at these tools and think about, how might this apply in my context, or how might we adapt it to address that problem? David?
Yeah, no, I have very little to add. I think, as you just pointed out, in so many of these situations, it starts with dialogue and consultation and listening to the concerns of the people on the ground, first and foremost, and really not going in with a preconceived idea that this project is happening, but really trying to first consult and listen and figure out if there is a way to address these value concerns and transform it into more of a how do we share the benefits kind of concern. So certainly a lot of the conflicts that we see related to hydropower, they're actually a bit of a mix. In many cases, they can be resolved. They're this question of benefit sharing and finding mutually beneficial interests, and many of them have that element. And we do see resolutions once the proponent goes in and actually listens to what the communities are asking for and tries to find a solution. We see them unblocked in many cases. So certainly consultation and listening, again, is a key part of it. Of course, there are other situations where not just the values, but it's a bad decision to go in and potentially develop in a highly environmentally sensitive area. And this is where it's really essential to have rock solid data about the risks. And I want to circle back to that question of the skill set. And I do think, being able to analyze a certain situation and look at the environmental risks, the social risks, the economic risks together, using a combination of qualitative and quantitative data, and being able to present that is essential. And so showing those trade-offs and showing the potential risks and opportunities across all the different sectors is really important. And I think that's really important in the context of dam development and any other major infrastructure or natural resource investment.
I'd also like to highlight, I've seen this not in the armed conflict context, but sometimes the disputes are not resolved. The dam is built. That's not the end of the story, though. That people have a very long memory, and we've seen both in the United States and in Canada, where dams that were built 30, 50, 70 years ago, there are still disputes around them. And it gets very interesting because those disputes are frozen. That you have the two sides, but the dam's built. What happens is when there's a new opportunity. So in Canada, some of the tribes that had been displaced by the construction of a large hydropower dam, I think it was 40, 50 years ago, they had lost the fight, but they still remembered it. And when the dam wanted to increase the height to have more power, suddenly there is a new dispute. And in order to move forward on the new dam issue, now there are more rights, more recognition of those rights, and you had to resolve those past grievances in order to move forward with the project. And similarly, in the US, most of the dams that were built, they were built long before the Endangered Species Act, before there was much concern about what would happen to the salmon and the other fish in the rivers. And this has been a sore point for a lot of the environmentalists. And so when the dams came up for renewal, they have a 60, 70-year license. They started having really vigorous legal fights. And one of the dam owners got tired of these fights and said, okay, let's sit down and talk about what a solution might be. And they came up with what's called a living license, because the problem is the solutions aren't always easy. So how do you restore salmon runs when you have a 70-foot, 100-foot dam and fish ladders don't seem to be working? And so they would commit to trying to setting up a process with the end goal there, but unclear which approach will work. And so this sort of adaptive management has been incorporated into a number of dam relicensing processes in the US to resolve the historic grievances. And so I think that it's important to note in the Brazilian context, even if it's lost, that doesn't mean that people forget and you move on. That you may move on, but people don't forget, and you still will often have to deal with those grievances sooner or later.
Let me just jump on there on that comment, Carl, and this idea of adaptive management inside an agreement, whether it's a peace agreement or a concession agreement or another agreement to deal with a natural resource. I actually think that's essential, given the variability, the natural variability of most natural resources, either their physical variability or their market variability. And it's so hard to actually fix a permanent value or fix a permanent quota in an agreement. So the idea of constantly reviewing, iterating, revising, and putting in place a process to do that is absolutely essential. And again, one of those core take-home messages I would say is part of the learning outcome of the course.
There's a question here about, is there a successful example of conflict prevention linked to oil and gas extraction in sensitive areas? I'm trying to think about where that might have been done. One thing I would say is that one of the primary grievances around oil and gas extraction is the benefit sharing. And so we've seen time and again that there have been disputes over benefit sharing, and one of the efforts to resolve it, one of the tools to resolve it, has been a benefit sharing agreement, a trust fund that's set up where a certain portion of the oil and gas revenues goes back to the community. And what we're seeing now is benefit sharing funds not only used to resolve disputes, but proactively, this is becoming a standard tool that when you're setting up oil and gas extraction, that you have a benefit sharing fund to prevent this source of conflict. We also see the question of free, prior, informed consent being used for conflict prevention, often in sensitive areas. That generally applies to indigenous peoples, but also to traditional communities. And a number of countries have extended it broadly to communities. But historically, legally, it generally applies primarily to indigenous communities. I haven't seen much use of free, prior, informed consent in oil and gas, though. That's generally for projects that relate to land management, forestry management, and other things. Governments, most countries view the extraction of oil, gas, and minerals as something that is determined by the sovereign. So, David, I don't know if there's anything you'd add here, maybe on managing.
I think, well, for
Go ahead.
me, the keys to conflict prevention, one of the most important is expectation management. And typically what happens is you have, exploration of a number of blocks. There may be some kind of small discovery. There may be a concession, a big signing bonus or a concession, and suddenly there's an expectation of a lot of jobs and a lot of money very quickly. And in fact, that kind of takes a long time to materialize. And so I think one of the really important things early on is managing those expectations. And I think the second thing is making sure that all the community has sufficient access to information about the project to inform that free, prior, and informed consent process. This is one of the things that we see is often an underlying cause of conflict, is this massive information asymmetry between what the company has, what the government has, and what the local community has. And that information asymmetry drives unrealistic expectations oftentimes. And it's those unrealistic expectations or unmet expectations that is a big source of conflict. I think the other source of conflict that links to benefit sharing is you get a community gives its consent to an oil or gas company to do the drilling. There's a benefit sharing agreement in place, but there aren't a lot of mechanisms to rigorously monitor compliance with that agreement. And so typically you get a lot of grievances coming in because there's a discrepancy or a dispute in what the expectation was of the agreement and what the delivery has been. And so I think one of the things we'd be pushing for is more transparency in those agreements and in the monitoring of those agreements, so that everybody is aware who's benefiting and where the terms and conditions that were initially agreed to actually complied with.
I guess the other thing that might be worth thinking about are the environmental and social impacts that often, much of the dialogue is around, much of the discourse is around who gets the benefits, how do you allocate them, how do you share them, but there's also management of the impacts. And I think that one of the tools, I'm trying to think about where this was done in a sensitive area, but one of the tools is environmental social impact assessment, which seeks to understand what the approaches or what the impacts of the project might be and proposed measures for mitigating the environmental impacts and the social impacts. Okay, there was another question here. I have tried to look at other causes of environmental security, but think that poverty, corruption, and climate change, among many others, are the primary drivers or drivers for irregular resource utilization, hence conflict. So I guess the person's asking, of all the different potential drivers of conflict, do some stand out? Poverty, corruption, and climate change, or are there others that we think might be important drivers of conflict?
Do you want to take a first stab at that, Carl, and I'll chip in?
So I would say first, this is a great question to ask Mark Levy in the next module. He's looked at a lot of these questions. I think that these are important drivers. I think that there are a couple of other things, a couple of nuances that are maybe harder to measure, but also very important. So poverty is a driver, but also inequality. So it's not just absolute poverty. It's when some people are poor and others are not. That's when we see a lot of conflict risk. So the inequality and the grievances that come out of that. I also think that related to that is and again, the question is how do you measure this objectively and quantitatively? But bad governance, lack of transparency, lack of consultation, lack of accountability, all of which lead to or provide grounds in which corruption can grow. But bad governance of natural resources and bad governance more broadly, one of the things that we've seen with the resource curse is that it's not any resources that cause conflict. They provide incentives for people to act in certain ways that may be more selfish, that might breed inequitable, corrupt actions. But it's really the failure of the governance system and society in how to address those resources. So I think that it's important to distinguish between the causes and the mediating factors that determine whether those stressors or tensions actually lead to violence.
Yeah, and I think the other way of looking at poverty is trying to look at it sort of a lack of other economic alternatives or a lack of other livelihoods and jobs. And so basically what we see is increasing vulnerability to, because the economy is poor, there's not a lot of opportunity, increasing vulnerability to move into illegal resource exploitation, illicit resource exploitation, or even to be co-opted into some kind of anti-government protest, or even moving into sympathy for terror groups. And so there's this vulnerability we need to get a handle around. And how does natural resource degradation, scarcity, drive human insecurity and vulnerability, which then has knock-on effects in terms of illicit and illegal resource exploitation. But I think the way I think those three certainly are very important. I think, as Carl said, inequality, and the other one I would say would be exclusion. Exclusion from a process and having no voice in a process is certainly a major driver of conflict.
David, I don't know if there are any of the questions that have been posed in advance, if there are any that you wanted to address. I think we have about 5 minutes left.
I'm just flipping back over to those. So if you want to take one, and I will come in a second.
Okay, so somebody had asked a question about the difference between negative peace and positive peace. And generally speaking, people have focused policies and a lot of the thinking until the late 60s thought of peace as the absence of violent conflict. If you can just get rid of war, we're at peace. And people, starting with Johann Galtung in the late 60s, early 70s, started thinking about other formulations of peace that had much more to do with building trust and building relationships and having resilience there, so that when there was a tension or a problem, that wasn't a hair trigger to conflict, that you were affirmatively at peace with somebody and not just not at war. David?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. There was a question with respect to how much resistance do intergovernmental agencies like the UN, I'm assuming that means the UN, face from local governments when we carry out assessments and appraisals. I think the first point to mention is that we don't do any kind of appraisal or assessment without the consent and with the request of a national government. So anytime we go into a country, it's always on the basis of a request. And typically where we have that request, one of the conditions, of course, is full access to the whole country. And by and large, we get it. We don't face, frankly, a lot of resistance from local governments. Kind of depends on the context, but by and large, we're there to listen. We're there to try to understand their needs and communicate them to the national government. And we're also there potentially to help them find projects to support their needs. So we don't get a lot of resistance. In fact, I've been in dozens and dozens of countries, and I can't think of a single time where we have met with resistance from a local authority. Usually it's open arms and very keen to share their experience and share their needs and have that voice heard by the UN so that we can then communicate that on to the national government.
And then I think there's one other question that I think would be interesting to close on. Person was asking what promoted the inclusion of natural resources in 2005 into major peace agreements. I think this is referring to the trend that we noted that historically few peace agreements addressed natural resources, and then from 89 to 2005 there were approximately 50% or a little more than that of the peace agreements addressed natural resources in the environment. And since 2005, every major peace agreement has addressed natural resources, often in multiple ways. And I guess the question is why? And David, you led the development or co-led the development of a major report on inclusion of natural resources into the peace processes. Wonder if you might speak to that.
Yeah, sure. I think there's two main reasons. In some of those conflicts, resources were an important driver of the conflict or an important financer of the conflict. I think the real reason is because they're an economic opportunity going forward, and different groups saw the opportunity and wanted to make sure that that opportunity was captured as part of the peace agreement itself. So I think post-conflict economic development and what's coming after the peace agreement gained more importance in that period, and people started thinking about how are we going to develop our natural resources, how are we going to share the revenues around our natural resources, and boy, that should be really situated in the peace agreement if we're going to ensure that there's some kind of monitoring with respect to these provisions going forward. So I would tend to argue it was part of the economic vision that natural resources were contributing to, and therefore they needed to be reflected in the peace agreement. But I think, as you rightly pointed out, Carl, I think it started with some of the big extractive resources and some of the ones that were financing conflict. But as you've seen, it's moved on to encompass more natural resources, in particular land and water have started to come in. But again, those resources come in where these are key local drivers of conflict. So I think to understand it, you have to understand the conflict and understand how the resource played into the conflict, and then you'll see how it plays into that specific peace agreement. So I do think it's a combination of factors. I think potentially there's also simply an awareness that it's important to put these into a peace agreement going forward, and so there was, in a sense, some learning going on between different peace tables, that if it happened to be in one peace agreement, other tables would say, hey, it was in that one, it should be in ours. So there was certainly some lessons learning, I think, going ahead between peace agreements and building on successes of previous ones.
And to be clear, this isn't just the parties to the peace agreement, but also the mediators who may have at one point been less inclined to deal with environmental issues, just trying to end the violence, and it taking a while for them to realize that it's necessary to address some of these issues, or feeling comfortable with how to address them if they don't have the expertise.
True, but just to caveat there, and this is, I mean, even if a mediator sees an opportunity, it's the parties that need to put it on the table. But as you say, the mediator needs to know how to deal with it if it is put on the table. And so one of the things that happened, the Department of Political Affairs actually created this standby team of mediation experts that could be deployed to help peace agreements, and they actually created a position on natural resources. One of the authors of that report, Michael Brown, was one of those mediators that actually went into these processes and tried to help mediate on different natural resource provisions. So, as you say, awareness was raising between different conflict parties, but also in the mediation community of the potential opportunity, and then how to seize upon that opportunity.
There's one last question that just came in, and maybe we could end on this one. It says, I wanted to ask about informal systems that proliferate when the government fails to meet the needs of populations. And presumably, this is especially in the context of conflict-affected countries. Once established, how is it possible to phase them out, taking into consideration the community's needs for these services, water, electricity, and the jobs provided by these informal systems?
I know, Carl, you've studied this. I can certainly give an initial reaction, and that is it all depends on the context and it depends on all kinds of factors, but why phase them out and why not try to formalize them and make them a part of the service delivery? So rather than shutting them down entirely, how can they become part of a formal service delivery process and actually give them the tools and the legal structure that they need to continue delivering those services as part of a government program or something like that. So my immediate reaction would be, if that context is correct, or if, let's say, the context itself is would allow formalization, then that would be the first thing I would probably look at doing, would be exploring opportunities to formalize and actually make those services part of core delivery. Carl, you've studied this more than I have, so what would you say?
I absolutely agreed that I guess the first thing is there's a question of why phase out. This is often a thought, and the argument is, well, these people, they don't have the certifications or the training. If they're delivering water, it might not be tested. So we really need to make sure the water is safe, so we need to phase them out. There is a new way that we're seeing that a number of countries are addressing this, and it's not to phase it out, it's to engage them and to formalize them progressively. This is especially important where you have the end of the conflict and, say, in this case, a lot of water delivery that may not hew to the public health requirements, but people still need the water. So building the capacity of those water delivery services, even as the government goes around and lays the pipes or other infrastructure. So it's the process of engaging and them and bringing them into the system is often, I would say this is a direction that a number of countries are doing. There's also, not just in the context of services, but in the context of land management, forest management, wildlife. A lot of the resources that are important for local livelihoods, the court system may not be effective or may not be trusted. The government may have had limited capacity to regulate and have a presence there. And so we see a lot of people, a lot of countries using what's called legal pluralism as a post-conflict approach. And we talk about this in Module 4. But the basic idea there is that even as the government is rebuilding and it's rebuilding governance nationally, that it's important to have a clarity on what rules apply, which institutions apply, and that the strategy that they have adopted is to, in many cases or for certain resources, recognize that local traditional or customary institutions and norms are often an effective approach for most of the decisions, and that you then retain appeal to the courts if that's not able to resolve the dispute, or if there are concerns about protecting rights that might be prejudiced in a more customary institution, for example, against women or against outsiders or ethnic minorities. David, is there anything you'd like to add on this?
No, I think that was a great addition, and thanks for that, and thanks for everybody for participating in this first office hours. I certainly enjoyed the discussion, and I hope that the course is going well. We've loved the feedback so far, and anything we can do to improve the experience, to improve the organization structure of the groups, to help you exchange lessons and exchange knowledge between yourselves, please let us know. I think you have all of our email addresses. Don't hesitate to send us an email and just let us know how we can help you absorb the content and share the content between you. So thanks very much again. Really enjoyed the session.
Thank you. Goodbye.